COP28 is underway in Dubai. What are the top issues on the agenda at this year's climate conference? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. On the first day of the UN climate conference, nations agreed to create a fund which has already raised more than $400 million to compensate those countries coping with loss and damage caused by climate change. This came as the United Arab Emirates called for ways to include a role for oil and gas in climate action. We begin with this report from Adel El Mahrouky.
Egypt, the president of the last conference of parties and the leader of all COP negotiations during the last year, says it's extremely worried. Giving his final words as president of COP27, Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry said that climate financing is shrinking at a time it should be doubling.
Rather than increasing climate finance from developed countries, actually it's decreasing in relation to the growing needs and the increasing cost of finance in developing countries. The expansion of fossil fuel exploration and production, in particular of coal, in countries that previously committed to substantially phase down. Another worrying sign is the increased gap in renewable energy expansion and availability.
The United Nations climate body UNFCCC too is alarmed.
We are taking baby steps, stepping far too slowly from an unstable world that lacks resilience to working out the best responses to the complex impacts that we are facing. We must teach climate action to run, because this has been the hottest year ever in humanity. So many terrible records were broken. Science tells us we have around 6 years before we exhaust the planet's ability to cope with our emissions, before we blow through 1.5-degree limits.
The presidency of COP moved to Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber, the former head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. Leading one of the biggest power companies in the world, Al Jaber called participants to lead what he described as unconventional changes in climate negotiations.
Since Paris, we have made some progress. But we also know that the road we have been on will not get us to our destination in time. We must look for ways and ensure the inclusion of the role of fossil fuels. We collectively have the power to do something unprecedented.
The UAE says COP this year will engage intensively with high-emission industries like aluminum, steel, cement, and public transportation. Unlocking affordable green financing for developing countries and allocating finance for the Loss and Damage Fund remain to be a major challenge and a target for participants this year. Criticism fell on the UNFCCC for choosing an oil-rich nation like the UAE to lead and influence climate talks throughout the next year. However, some say that the Gulf nation's influential power in the oil and gas field could finally ease the usual deadlock with oil giants across the world. Adel El Mahrouky, CGTN, Dubai.
Okay, to discuss proceedings at this important conference, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Beijing, Changhua is the China Director at the Office of Jeremy Rifkin. From Arizona, we're joined by Mahmoud. He is a Senior Fellow and the Director of the Climate and Water Program at the Middle East Institute. Here in Washington, D.C., Bob Watson is the former Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And Robert Orr is the Dean of the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, former United Nations Under-Secretary General and former Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on Climate Change. Welcome to all of you. Dr. Orr, so on the first day of COP28, we have a key development, the deal for the Loss and Damage Fund, which was brokered at COP27 in Egypt, is now operational. What does this do? What does this fund do? We heard our reporter tell us about some of the challenges it faces, and how important is it in combating climate change?
This loss and damage fund is important both politically because it is an essential piece of the package needed by a range of countries in the developing world to be able to address the losses and damage that climate change has inflicted. But it is also extremely important for the funding the operational needs of transitions and to make economies and societies more resilient, not just in small island developing states, though most certainly there, but also in a wide range of developing countries that do not have the financing they need to be able to adapt to what we already see as dramatic changes in their climate.
Changhua, we have seen some movement in the battle against climate change over the past few weeks. The Chinese President Xi Jinping, he was in San Francisco just a few weeks ago. He had talks with US President Joe Biden. They were at the APEC summit. At that leaders meeting. China, of course, is one of the, together with the United States, took the lead in the signing of the Paris Accords. That was several years ago in 2015. So what does China hope will come out of COP28?
From China's side, I think like all the rest of the world, we definitely want to deliver a successful COP28 process. When I say successful, I mean there should be some substantial substance, actually outcomes coming out of the 2 weeks negotiation process. As agreed by the two largest economies and the two largest emitters a few weeks ago in California, through this U.S.-China climate sort of joint statements, there were some specific items, commitments actually put on the table. For instance, between now and 2030, we should double energy efficiency, triple, renewable energy. But in the meantime, really pay more attention to address emissions of methane emissions there as well. And what's encouraging is that those sort of commitments have been very well received or embraced by the global business community, as well as well embedded in the COP28 process. So yes, from China's side, China wants to bring its own experience, commitment, and outcomes to the COP process. But in the meantime, very importantly, to support ongoing and also successful COP28 process.
Right, Changhua, well, you say those commitments have been well received by the business community. But this is a joint effort. It's going to take all the countries in the world to get to the kind of targets that are being talked about right now. I mean, is there the political will right now?
Well, it really depends on which half of the glass you will look at. If you look at half empty, of course, it's really far from adequate. But in the meantime, if you look at the other half, which is full, and you probably will be, very inspired, encouraged to see the progress is made already, and more innovation, more financing flowing into both, elevating energy efficiency as well as very aggressively, ambitiously investing in renewable energy sector. I think China definitely has set a great example. When I say business community responses is that if you look at many of the size events at COP28 from now in the next 2 weeks there, pretty much those are among the major themes actually being debated, discussed, advocated by the business community, and the message are pretty much aligned with doubling energy efficiency, at least tripling renewable energy. In the meantime, really seriously addressing other greenhouse gas emissions, particular methane. Beyond that, we started to see other themes actually also covered. We know the importance of nature. Right. That's why we are advocating the nature plus, nature positive solutions. In the meantime, really understand decoding the nexus between climate change, nature, as well as food and agriculture security.
Mahmoud, as Dr. Robert Orr told us a moment ago, the operations of the Loss and Damage Fund will be a huge win for those countries most affected by climate change. These are countries in the developing world. But we've seen reports recently that these very countries are still skeptical of the role of institutions like the World Bank, which they feel cater more to the global north rather than the global south. So given that, what do you hope will come out of COP28 to ease those concerns?
Yeah, that's a great point that I think gets lost in the shuffle in terms of the announcements today. I mean, you recall at the end of COP27, the announcement of the Loss and Damage Fund, the agreement, that was a big success and lauded as such. But since then, up until the beginning of this COP meeting, COP28, behind the scenes, the Transitional Committee was working hard to kind of iron out some of the details associated with the Loss and Damage Fund. And there wasn't a lot of agreement. There was certainly a tense standoff between developing nations and developed nations. Developing nations wanted the fund to not be housed at an institution in a developed nation, so that they feel they have more input and sort of influence on how decisions are made. The developed nations push back in that there are some countries categorized in the developing world per the UNFCCC that could actually put in to the fund as opposed to those traditionally in the global north. So there was this back and forth that ultimately led begrudgingly to the fact that the World Bank will now, at an interim basis, manage this fund. But the good news, as you've indicated at the beginning of the conversation, that first day COP28 managed to come to agreement in terms of funding, significant funding from a number of sources spearheaded by the UAE and Germany, I believe 100 million each, and others followed, the UK, United States, Japan. But as they say, the reward for good work is more work. And yes, financing the fund is certainly step one, but there's still a lot of questions moving forward, certainly now, that the role that the World Bank has in play in terms of how do you categorize who receives these funds in developing nations, under what category? Are all these funds purely going to finance damages of the past, or will some of it actually help to avoid damages of the future, focusing on future-looking adaptation? So there's still a lot of detail to come forward. I'm hopeful some of that will come through the COP meeting, but I suspect a lot of that will be punted till afterwards as part of the World Bank oversight and the Transitional Committee. The committee moving forward will look into those details. But certainly, the financing of the fund is potentially a first step to hearing more announcements in terms of funding for other traditional funds. So we'll be keeping an eye on that.
Bob Watson, so this fund will address, as Mohammed just pointed out, the damages of the past and the present. We're seeing things like food security issues right now, migration issues, infrastructure issues. So it's going to have to do that, as well as help those developing countries move towards renewable sources of energy.
Well, there's another fund, much larger, which will indeed help developing countries in both mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation. So the Loss and Damage Fund must not be mixed up with the much larger, at the present, Climate Fund for adaptation and mitigation. So we need all three funds to be well managed and to be well funded.
One other thing, Bob Watson, I mean, a major topic at this conference will be the phasing out of fossil fuels, yet many members have not signed up to the UN net zero targets. And we add to that the fact that many countries are actually torn right now between phasing out things like oil, like coal, and then moving towards renewable sources of energy. Where are we headed in that respect?
Well, let me first say, we've got to get past the rhetoric that we've seen in previous COPs. We need monitorable actions that are quantitative. We need to know what will governments do explicitly between now and 2030, between 2030, 2040, 2050, to phase out greenhouse gas emissions. And that means, how do we phase out fossil fuels unless the carbon emitted is captured through something called carbon capture and storage? We do need to phase out fossil. We need to increase renewable energies much, much faster, and we need to use our energy much, much more efficiently, and we have to make our agricultural land use systems much more sustainable. At present, we're on a pathway of 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius, not 1.5 to 2. We've got to be honest with ourselves. We are way off track at the moment, and that's because of the continued use of fossil fuels.
Dr. Robert Orr, of course, this is a very ambitious conference, COP28. The president of COP28, he set out 4 themes to be tackled at this year's event. The first is fast-tracking energy transition. The second is fixing climate finance. Third is protecting nature, people, and lives and livelihoods. And the fourth is inclusivity in climate management. How do you see these issues playing out? Is there too much on the plate here?
No, it's not too much at all. In fact, all 4 are possible. It is significant that the first item that the COP president identified is the energy transition. Obviously, UAE is a player in fossil energy, but also an increasingly significant player in renewable energy. The major outcome that is required from COP28 is really a fulsome energy transition package that governments need to agree to triple renewable energy globally by 2030. They need to agree to double energy efficiency by 2030. They need to agree to ensure energy access for all by 2030. And they need to agree to accelerate the phase out of all fossil fuels on a time frame consistent with 1.5 degrees. These are all big asks, but this should be known as the energy COP. Yeah. And if this package can be delivered, it will make the novel instrument of the global stocktake, the inaugural global stocktake that is taking place in Dubai, it will deliver the goods. So let's make this the energy conference of parties.
Right, I want to talk about that global stocktake in a moment. But Dr. Orr, you know, we often hear this figure of 1.5 degrees. Is it still attainable?
The recent GAP report identified that there is still a window to achieve 1.5 degrees. We know that it is closing, it is tightening with every passing year, but it is still there. The science shows that it's possible, but it will take a series of accelerations. The primary one that this COP can deal with is the energy transition. All of the outcomes that I just mentioned need to happen by 2030. 2030 is virtually tomorrow. So that's why this COP is central to achieve acceleration, in particular in the energy transition.
Changhua, what kind of progress are you seeing in China on the effort to phase out fossil fuels? You know, we're talking about a country that is highly industrialized, that is a manufacturing hub. What are the challenges?
Well, the biggest challenge, I call it the curse of coal, because, you know, if you look at the energy mix, unfortunately, China has to rely heavily still on coal, which is probably one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle we need to address in order to really bridge the gap in terms of emission reductions there. Now, on the progress side, and a couple of ways of looking at it. One, if you look at China's delivery or outcome through the Paris Agreement, and China has already been sort of overachieving its commitments. And if you look at the carbon intensity, China has already achieved 51% over 2005 level, and of course aiming to achieve at least 65%. This is the carbon intensity, or you call it efficiency target there by 2030. Now, the second track is really alternative renewable energy, non-fossil fuels there. Very important elements in that context is this 1,400 gigawatts of wind and solar installations by 2030. What's exciting for everyone to see is that by now, you just look at the solar energy itself, actually, we are definitely way beyond that. Everyone is forecasting that China will be able to overachieve that, hit that target at least 5 years ahead of the schedule. So that's one part. If you look at mobility, if you look at the batteries, EVs, last year or so, 60% of new EVs put on, literally on road are in China. So from both energy efficiency and renewable energy perspective, China presents a very good and exciting, inspiring example for the global community to understand that. I do want to bring up one particular point. We cannot be too simplistically just coming to COP and saying, yeah, we need to phase out the coal, phase out fossil fuels there. We do need to deep dive. We need to address root causes why we are still stuck in the fossil fuel landscape there, why the progress has been so slow, because without that sort of understanding, it's going to be really, really hard actually to address those issues rather than just everyone going to COP, just advocating, talking, rather the actions will continue to lag behind.
Mohammed Mahmoud, there was a piece in Foreign Policy written by Manal Shihabi. She's an associate faculty member at the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Oxford University, and I'm going to quote part of that piece to you. She said, "The global north had its opportunity to industrialize without regard to climate change effects, and its prosperity benefited from developing countries' resources through colonization. For the global south, calls for climate change, or climate action rather, which deprive them of a potential source of economic development and energy access without providing funding is akin to asking them to fund the global north's energy transition." Is that a fair point that Dr. Shihabi makes there?
It's an interesting point. I mean, part of it is certainly accurate. When you look at historical emissions since 1850, and you can argue the point of mass industrialization to date, and you look at it in different regions of the world in terms of the contribution, you can certainly see there's a disproportionate emission percentage that's coming out of the global north or the west, depending on how you classify it, those regions that fall under those categories, and significantly less in other parts of the world. In fact, in the Middle East region, and certainly when we look at the Middle East region, we focus on the Gulf countries, which are now considered one of the larger producers of fossil fuel. To date, their percentage is quite small, and I blank out on the number exactly, but it is disproportionately smaller than other countries. So in that regard, it is true. But one thing to also consider is, and just sort of pick off a previous point that was made, is addressing this issue in terms of the energy transition. Yes, renewables is certainly top of the agenda, but I think part of the point that was made, why are we stalling? Why is there not enough progress being made? I think part of it is true, I agree that we're looking at this problem a little too simplistically. Yeah. It's beyond just energy transition, but looking at multiple tracks on how to do that. Carbon capture and storage, low emission types of fuel, mass electrification, brought up the points of EVs, looking at how mobility and transportation of goods and people affects the emission component. So it's more than just focusing on the energy transition in terms of renewables, which is very important, but looking at where are we stalling and how do we incrementally make that change so it's not too late in terms of bending the warming curve in the future.
Bob Watson, let's look at something that was mentioned a moment ago, and that is global stocktake. This year's event will be the first global stocktake. Al Jazeera, the television network, described it as, quote, a scorecard analyzing countries' progress towards meeting the goals of the Paris Accord so they can adapt their strategies for the next climate action plans, which are due in 2025. What are your thoughts on where we are right now?
Well, we're completely off track at the moment. As I said earlier, we're on a pathway to 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius. And most of the projections are that the emissions in 2030 could be the same or higher than today, not 50% lower than today, which is what we need for 1.5. The stocktake is absolutely essential, but it's all forms of emissions of greenhouse gases, all energy forms, but also agriculture. Agriculture is 30%, agricultural land use, about 30% of global emissions, energy about 70%. So the question is, how between now and 2030 can we even try and get a 50% reduction in greenhouse gases? I see no evidence that there is political will for those sort of reductions in the near term. Everybody keeps talking about net zero in 2050, which is important. But what is most important are emission reductions now. That's what's needed to get on a pathway to net zero. And we need quantitative reductions, which we can monitor. So the stocktake, absolutely critical.
Dr. Orr, we just heard two of your colleagues tell us a moment ago that we have to be careful of addressing this in too simplistic a way. As Changhua Wu told us, we need to look at the root causes of what is causing this. Why is it slow, the transition? Why is the transition so slow? In some instances, it has stalled. What are your thoughts on that? Hi, Dr. Oh, can you hear me? Okay, I think we have a problem there. Let me move to Changhua Wu. Changhua Wu, this year, as we just heard earlier on, is considered to be the hottest on record. So that goal is to keep the threshold at 1.5 degrees, but it is getting closer to 3 degrees. This is also affecting people's health. And the World Health Organization says the focus should be on people's health. That's what needs to be at the forefront of climate actions. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think we started to get better understanding in terms of the health impact from extreme climate events. I think we've already been going through the extreme heat waves, wildfires, and droughts, floods, you name it. And we've been losing too many lives, and really people's health has been dramatically endangered at this moment. So I'm delighted to see World Health Organization and the scientists around the world are bringing up this particular issue and put that into the COP process. It's also a complicated one because, say we recognize the problem, how do we address that? So adding another dimension into the already complicated landscape to address the climate change issues there, we all understand how challenging, how tough that's going to be in order to generate something meaningful out of the COP negotiation process. But at least at this moment, climate health impact has been elevated to the global level, and that's something policymakers need to really pay attention to.
Okay, Dr. Oh, I'm glad that you're back with us. I've only got about 40 seconds, though. We heard from two of your colleagues earlier on that we need to be careful about too simplistic an approach and just calling for change, calling for transition. We need to address the root causes, in many instances, of why the transition is so slow. In some cases, it has stalled. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, transition is not just a series of bottlenecks, it's opportunities. President Biden recently spoke about when he thinks climate change, he thinks jobs, jobs, jobs. Yep. There is huge opportunity in transition, and seizing those opportunities is going to require investments in all economies, in the targeted sectors that this Stocktake will identify. And that is really what we could get out of this COP this year. Roadmap for where we need to make those investments, and then the opportunities and unleash not only the public money to make those investments, but unleash the much larger
we
sums
need to
of
leave it
private
there.
capital.
Right. Sorry to interrupt you, but we need to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us on the show. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.